Okay, welcome everybody. We're back here in my wormery, and if you've been here before, you'll recognize what's in the background here. These are my active pots and bins that are presently housing worms. I'm just at the stage here where I'm going to be feeding one of my bins, a couple of my bins, and I thought I'd bring everyone along. At the same time, I thought I might also check in on these active bins back here to give people a peek at what's going on. It's been about a month since I last published a video, and this was just an opportunity to shoot some footage and bring everyone along for the ride while I feed the bins on this next go around. So I'll get some gloves on and we'll get started. So recently I've been taking all the scraps that come out of the kitchen and things like the shavings from peeling carrots and potatoes and things like that have nice small pieces by nature, and anytime we're doing cabbage or lettuce or anything, I try to preserve some of those outer leaves that go in the trash anyway. And I've been using those to wrap little, kind of like little, I don't even know what to call these, but the little bundles of tinier scraps inside. Everything was frozen once before, even before it was wrapped into these bundles. And then after it was all wrapped up, it was put back into the freezer again. So I've got a number of these to feed with, and then I've also got some whole pieces of just the end of a piece of cucumber here and a banana peel. So the other thing I've got handy here is the sprayer. I've been finding that this bin that we're going to be working on is a bit dry, so I'm going to possibly add some moisture to it as well. So let's get started and see how things. Okay, so once again, if you've been here before, you'll notice that the coffee filter is my indication of where the last feeding occurred. So yeah, I normally shoot with a tripod and I have both hands free. Right now I'm holding the phone. You'll also notice I have kind of a spotlight, so I'm wearing a headlamp to illuminate the scene, get a better sense of what we're looking at here. So divot for it, and oh, actually look at this. Here we got some food scraps. This stuff looks like it's going away back. If memory serves me correctly, this stuff was not frozen. I just threw it into the bin as is. Actually, here's another chunk of it. You might recognize it. It's broccoli, but you can also see that worms have already gotten down into it. And I could smell it. It definitely smells like broccoli, but it doesn't smell too bad. And it was buried, so they definitely seem to have found something in here that appeals to them. Seems like in between the stems, there's a lot of activity here. So, all right, so that looks pretty good actually, but nevertheless, I think in the interest of just keeping these things well fed, perhaps a little bit better fed than in the past as I have, I'm going to just go ahead and add one of those little bundles of food. So I don't know. Here's more worms. I guess maybe I just put the coffee filter in the wrong place when I rested it down. This is obviously where the last feeding occurred, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just take this spot right over here and take one of these. Take this really large one here, and I took these out of the freezer a couple hours ago, so you can see they've already thawed out. But you can see inside here different stems and scraps and the ends of different stuff. So I think the fact that this has been frozen should allow it to more readily become available. You can see a lot of the ice crystallizing on it as well, so I'm hoping that some of the moisture from this newly added food also helps with the dryness of this bin. So, let's get this one back up. And you know what? As long as we're here, this is a good-sized bin, and I do want to sort of get in the habit of feeding these more regularly and more heavily. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to give them another one. let's do that. Let's give them, let's throw this banana peel in here as well. It was also frozen. And you can feel how soft it is now that it's thawing out. Unlike just taking a raw one that was just eaten and putting it in there. And I'm going to take another one. Take the smaller one here. Kind of break it up for easy access. So I would think that in a week's time or so, there's going to be a lot of action going on here. So I'm going to make sure that I put my little marker in the right place this time. Let's get this covered up and get the next bin started. Okay, so now we're on to the 2 round bins. One thing you didn't notice was that I did use the sprayer on the square bin, and I did add some moisture. So here we go. Let's get some. Let's see what's going on in here. It's rather dry on top. I think this will need some moisture as well. That's what I've been doing on these little bins since there's such small amount of surface area on top. I've just been removing all this dry material from the top. I'll do that on the same here on this one. And then I can dig into the moist stuff where the worms are and see what's happening. So you can already see some stuff happening. You might even see some scraps of food here and there. But like I said, I'd really like to get into a more frequent cycle of feeding these more regularly, because maybe while what's in there is nice and pureed and soft and being eaten, new stuff I think really needs some time to break down before the worms can really get at it. I just want to make sure there's adequate time for the food to break down for them to be able to get right at it once they're out of the previous feedings portion. Alright, so let's see, let's grab go ahead and grab one of these. I'm going to break it up like I did on the last one and make it a little bit more readily accessible. And as long as there's a lot of moisture in there already, I'm going to take some of this bedding and drop it right in there to let it moisten up just from the process of being eaten, hopefully, or being exposed to that moist food in there. And come up with this moist material that's around it. I think these, because there's examples of when your wall back and frozen, still frozen. Put that back in there. So that's not really freeze the food, just let it start breaking down. Okay, so let's drop some of this dry stuff back on top. Okay, we'll take a look at this one here. See what they've got going on. Alright, similar stuff going on here. Stuff that was dropped in here raw without being frozen or anything like that. Still has some good firm texture to it, although it is starting to break down, so the worms are finally making their way into it. And regardless of the fact that there's already a fair amount of food in here, I'm going to go ahead and drop in the rest of what's been allocated. Take a little peek in here what we got going on. We're already squirming away from the light, but that's normal. So I wasn't that big of a fan of these little pot bins because I guess, partially because there's a lack of surface area and the difficulty one has digging around just because it's so small and narrow. So, as much as I like the results I'm getting, I've got good moisture levels and the worms seem happy and everything. I think I'm going to be taking a departure from using these types of containers. But, alright, let's finish what we started here. Let's get some dry material in underneath. A little bit of a cushion. We throw in this chunk of cucumber and bust open one of these little packets of food for them. And then maybe throw a little bit more of this dry material on top of that. There isn't much left. Scoop up what's remaining and then just cover it up. grab a little bit more of this dry material from this one and bring it over here. I don't think we're going to see much of this dry material any longer. I think the food that I just dropped in is going to help boost the moisture level in these containers significantly. But, all right. So I'll cover these babies back up and we'll get on to taking a peek at the other bins. So these bins are back on their position on the shelf. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but now those bins that we just completed have been in service for 38 days now. Okay, so the next ones that we're going to take a peek at have been active now for 63 days, so just a little bit over 2 months, or almost exactly 2 months if you want to look at it that way. So let's get these over on the table and take a peek at how they're doing. No feeding for these or anything. These were just tended to a day or two ago, but we'll take a peek anyway. Okay, so here we go. Let's take a look here. It's a very thin layer of dry on the top. I can already feel that it's moist. Very shallow. You can even see some glistening of moisture already. Because, yeah, you can already see some of the chunks of food that have been placed here recently. This food was only placed here a day or two ago, so it's unlikely that it's going to have much worm action. And, you know, on that same thought, I really don't want to dig down below the recently added food to see what's going on here, but at least I can sense that the moisture levels seem about right, and things are starting to happen here. Actually, on this one you can see quite a fair number of worms making their way into the newly added food, so I can definitely see the benefit to freezing the stuff before putting it in here, because this food's only been in here a few days and it almost seems like they're on it already. So freezing definitely has its benefits for sure. So whatever, let's take a look at this one here. This one's going to be easier to see just because we can probe around more readily than in these tall containers. But there again, my symbol for where feeding occurred was the coffee filter, so somewhere around here is where we're probably going to find the most recently added layer of food. And yep, there it is. All kinds of shavings from a big batch of soup, and you can already see some curious critters making their way into it. So once again, I think reaffirming the value of freezing before feeding, because it seems like it really gives them a good leg up on making their way into the food. So in other places you could see there is fairly dry, maybe drier than most people would keep their bins. But every time I become skeptical of the moisture content, I always find that I've got worms in it. They don't seem to mind too much, so I don't want to second guess myself too much. I know that this is still a learning phase for me since I'm new to this whole game, but still I think I'm getting the hang of it, and I think the moisture levels I've been maintaining are almost just right. Okay, it looks pretty good as far as I can tell. So let's get this food covered up again, and we'll get the next batch out here to look at. Alright, so now they're back in place, and we have one final bin left. That's the one that's down here. And this one is now at day 138. So this one is approaching the point where I think I might be harvesting it soon. Maybe within the next 2 weeks. Somewhere around 150. But this is also the bin that I prepared the last video on, which was a setup for a horizontal migration. So let's get this one out and we'll take a closer look at what I'm talking about. Right, so like I mentioned a moment ago, this one, I guess out of frustration that I had in sifting through all this little tiny minutia in the bins and finding tons of worms commingled and everything, it seemed like the time-saving approach was to kind of gear up for a horizontal migration of the worm population and encourage the worms on their own to sort of move out of the done castings and kind of make their way over to one or the other end of the bin. And the motivation for that is obviously food, positive motivation. So what I did was I set this side of the bin up in such a way that the existing contents were all shoved over to the left, and in that right side I placed a whole new set of bedding and food, and almost like a new bin over in the last 6 inches on this edge, in the hopes that the population will, on its own, make its way over to this side. And I think the strategy for harvesting these castings is going to be a little different too. I'm thinking maybe go through a couple waves of maybe allowing the worms to really attack the food that's been added on this end, kind of drawing a large amount of the population over and then bringing some of those worms out and over into a new bin, but then leaving this a little further with an additional new load of food and bedding, so that hopefully if there's any more worms remaining, it would coerce them to convince them to sort of depart from the done material and make their way into the not yet processed material. So so you can see some of the recently added stuff. It's very fresh in color. Hasn't really had much of a chance to break down yet, but was also all frozen prior to introduction. So you can already see it's beginning to get infiltrated by worms in some places. And that's good. That was the most recent feeding. But the last few feedings have all been over on this end. And you can see the food is quite plentiful. Some of it was just recently added a day or two ago. Some of it's been in here for quite some time, a couple weeks now. So there's food in here that's at various stages of decay and consumption. And I just didn't want any of it to kind of get depleted and have the worms think that the food supply is dwindling. I want to just make sure that they have this sense that there's a continuous, constant supply of food for them to enjoy. Alright, one last peek. See what we got going on back here. Good. Definitely looks like what I've been after in terms of sort of gaining control over what the worms are doing and how things are progressing. I guess the other observation is that the bins left for longer periods of time, like this one approaching the 150-day mark, just the worms seem a lot more at home. They're abundant. The moisture levels throughout the bin are good because it's almost all castings at this point. So I think what I've done in the past of harvesting bins at the 75-day interval and the 100-day interval might have been a little bit too, I don't know if the word is ambitious. I think it was just more a matter of impatience, since these were all really my first bins, and this is really the third of three of my first 3 bins that I ever started, and maybe it's a sentimental value of just keeping this one going for a little while longer. So like I said, I think my next strategy is going to be to depopulate worms once they've congregated heavily in the fed area, move them in a couple waves into some new bins that are going to be starting soon, and maybe even do that in a couple waves to really permit enough time for the worms to eventually make their way out of this, leaving me with as little work as possible to get the castings harvested. Well, I think we're almost done here. Just figured I'd come back here for a moment, and you might have noticed a couple things over here. Not sure if they've been explained in previous videos, but basically these bins are not populated yet, but they've been sort of pre-built, and all the materials were laid in, just to let the materials sort of gel together and let all the moistures and flavors commingle, so that when the worms make their way in there, it's not a bunch of, you know, dry, hard stuff, but everything's got a good consistency to it. So I don't think I'm going to be using these bins. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm probably taking a departure from using these tall bins or anything small like this, and I'm going to be focusing my energy on more of these types of tubs. Thank you for joining me. All right, that concludes our visit for the day. Bye-bye. Thanks again.